headed toward a restoration of a gold standard, or is there a willingness to embrace proof of inevitable failure and singular solution, for example? How would Austrians relate to that if you could get some Austrians to consider it with an open mind?
Well, I think the main thing is it's not that any Austrian is thinking that gold has to be the money. I think the more correct thing is to say that they would predict, if it weren't for government interventions of various types, they think the market would naturally go back to adopting money. But if for some reason they didn't, and like there are some people in the Austrian community that think this Bitcoin thing is the wave of the future. So I mean, nobody would say, oh, that doesn't make sense, and we should use force to try to steer things the way we think they ought to go. I think when anyone talks about gold as money, they just mean they predict empirically that's what free people would end up going back to. I'm still not sure exactly what you're proposing as an alternative, but I think at the very least, as long as your proposal, you would just try to convince people to adopt it voluntarily, then no Austrian would be against that. They might just predict that wouldn't take off.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I've been up against it for 43 years now, so yeah. And I'm very pleased to fathom that you are, I'd have to say the most open-minded Austrian who I've ever conversed with to this point, which is, really, truly, in fact, I think wonderful. But I think in general, they do tend to want to become defensive with the ideas of Austrian economics. That is, the supposed adherents who are, supporting, Ron Paul, let's return to the gold standard, or let's destroy the Fed. But in so doing, preserving banking, which still is going to be this obfuscation of the currency, because to restore the individual's right to issue promissory obligations, which is something that I advocate is wrongful, is criminal to deny me, then this would, if we restored the individual's right to issue promissory obligations, which is in fact what we have, we're still issuing promissory obligations under this obfuscation of the currency. They're just obfuscated into falsified debts to the pretended banking system, which is not, is not a banking system at all in the concept or connotation of a storehouse. They're a modern money changer. So would Austrian economics, being as it's your promissory obligation to me, would it insist on denying you your right to issue a promissory obligation free of exploitation by this purported banking system, which is obfuscating your promissory obligation into a process which multiplies your initial obligation into terminal indebtedness? There's nothing in Austrian economics which suggests that there should even be a desire to deny you of a right to issue your free promissory obligation, is there? I mean, I don't discover one in anything that I write, but this seems to be the notion of everyone who wants to defend Ron Paul somehow as having a solution which they can't even articulate, by attempting to deny a prospective solution which they're generally unwilling to evaluate and just simply reject off the cuff, so to speak, without being able to disprove a single of its mere small handful of inherent principles.
Well, sure. So I think, like no Rothbardian would. I think I would put it this way. It's not the way I would respond to what you're saying. It's not that the Austrians are still in favor of banking, but they would just say anybody can go into the banking business. So in a sense, if I understand what your proposal is, when you build a house and then sell it to me and I write you a note, then I'm a banker in a sense, and then there'd be open entry into the industry. And so I think that's the way the Austrians would handle that.
Again, then, there's no inherent disagreement here at all. In fact, well, we might fine-tune our concept here. I'm not advocating that everyone go into the banking industry. I'm saying that the very currency that we are subject to now is comprised of our very own promissory obligations. I'm advocating to get the banking industry's illegitimate imposition of interest and laundering of principal into their position out of the picture so that we can persist in an immutable currency which in fact sustains our intentions to trade as ever we determine subjectively, however we do. To be a little bit more clear about my proposition of mathematically perfected economy, then, what it is an actual restoration of the natural facts of obligation in a promissory obligation. And I wouldn't consider it that as an individual, if I issue you a promissory obligation, I'm actually engaging in the banking business. What I'm doing is I'm committing to pay for your production as I consume of it, because any lesser rate of payment would corrupt the volume of circulation. But in which arrangement you as the real creditor are paid in full from the outset so long as the integrity of the circulation is maintained. So that's the only role of government, and that would be certifying my creditworthiness, in other words, my capability to pay for consuming your production as I consume of it, and then enforcement of the payment, which would be, of course, on the behalf of all of us, which, of course, in particularly in the case of enforcing payment, could in today's day and age be implemented through computer processes where we wouldn't even have to have physical money. We would have what I would call a common monetary foundry, which takes the place of a central banking system and maintains the accounts of the people. Therefore, its only further responsibility is certifying creditworthiness, which is a process that's automated as well. In other words, we decide what the criteria are, and we the people together, and therefore agreeing on the criteria for certifying creditworthiness. That is just automatically performed by software without any prejudice whatsoever. And so our money is issued on promissory obligations as it is today, but we freed them of the exploitation of the banking system. And the result of this is, instead of paying $1,000 a month for a $100,000 home with a 100-year lifespan, as we might in this system, you divide the 100-year lifespan into the lifespan of into the value of the home, and you come out with $1,000 per year, or $83.33 a month, if we figure consumption in a linear manner, which I don't advocate, but for the sake of mathematics simplification, to understand the issues, that's the relative disparity. So of course we'd have very little homelessness in the country if people could afford a brand new $100,000 home for $83 a month. So, and we likewise would be generally across the board approximately 12 times as liquid without any change whatsoever, even though we suffer a drastically diminished state of prosperity under the terminal sum of indebtedness that we're suffering now, and in which this banking system prevents us from having any way whatsoever of ever resolving. All of the things which artificially extend the lifespan today only accumulate further debt. I mean, Obama's proposition of the federal government creating jobs, which I imagine would be contrary to any disposition of Austrian economics, and which isn't even a truth anyway, that the federal government creates the jobs. All it's really doing is relieving us to some extent by decreasing taxes, which are to pay for this terminal sum of federal indebtedness, decreasing those taxes somewhat, in other words, decreasing the crimes of the federal government against us so that we can survive just enough that we might create some more jobs, however many that might be, and however little that might even provide the markets with further sustainability that they could consume the production of those jobs, which of course the following day, business basically denied that, the proposition would even create jobs. So this is all about, an actual solution to these things. And what I would hope, and I've attempted to do since 1980. I've had a dozen close friends of Ron Paul, neighbors and whatnot, try and get us together about mathematically perfected economy since 1980, and instead, the appeals are met with nothing but evasion. And so what you're saying tends to make me think that evasion isn't really the genuine disposition of Austrian economics. I mean, if Hayek had this question, that something else might account for these issues, I would hope and I would think that Austrian economics and economists such as yourself would, at least engage in dialogue as you are now about true solution of the issues. And I mean, we have the same objects. Free markets, truly free markets. You can't have a truly free market if somebody is obfuscating our promissory obligations into falsified debts to itself, enriching itself without justification to the extent of all the principle it's ever created in the first case, in the first hand rather, and then in the second hand is multiplying the original falsified debts into terminal falsified indebtedness, dedicating ever more of a circulation to sustaining falsified debt rather than sustaining the industry and commerce which are obligated to do so. I mean, obviously that's not a free market, and I would think the lights should go on in Austrian economists' head if they share the same object, and we would say, well, why? That idea deserves proper evaluation. Does it have a hole in it? Does it have a flaw in it? If so, what is it? What breaks it down? And if in fact we can maintain this perpetual one-to-one relationship between circulation, remaining value of represented property, and remaining obligation to pay just that much for the remaining value of represented property by no more than eradicating interest, freeing the people to issue their own promissory obligations free of exploitation, and an obligatory schedule of payment. If just those two things accomplish all this, I would think, my God, who would argue against this?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm unfortunately at a little bit of a disadvantage just because I don't, I would probably would need to read something more on what your exact proposal is. I guess the only thing I could say is to the extent that you are thinking that we should have the government be actively involved in administering this idea, I could imagine a lot of Ron Paul people, pulling back and saying, oh, wait a minute, we can't trust, even if you were right, I don't know if we're going to trust them to administer this thing properly. So I guess that would be the one thing.
Yeah, but that's the incredible incongruity of resisting it on those grounds, because this is the only solution that totally takes the government out of the picture. The circulation is regulated to the penny to be equal and representative, immutably representative of all represented property, merely by eradicating interest and an obligatory schedule of payment. What you're paying for the diminishment of value of the represented property, which is your consumption, leaving in circulation what represents the remaining value at all times with no regulation whatsoever. So while, yes, this belongs in the hands of government has no authority whatsoever to regulate anything. The people determine the whole volume of circulation. The obligatory schedule of payment maintains a circulation at all times which is equal to the remaining value of represented property, and software handles it all.
Well, yeah, like I say, it sounds very interesting, and I can understand why Ron Paul type fans would recoil from that. I'm just explaining to you why I think that would have happened. But you're right. Theoretically, I would need to look at it and see exactly what it is if I thought there was some major hole in it. But I don't know enough as to what you're recommending for me to say one way or the other.
Uh-huh. Well, this is a good meeting, Bob. I mean, because I certainly warmly embrace any interest from the Austrian community. It's very unfortunate that the political desires to